Generation X was not raised in stability. They were raised in transition. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, they grew up during a cultural shift that most people underestimate. The post-war optimism of the boomers was fading. Institutions that once felt permanent marriage, corporate loyalty, political integrity, were beginning to fracture. Divorce rates spiked. Corporate layoffs became normal. Political scandals broke public trust. The Cold War created background anxiety, and children absorb atmosphere long before they understand language. Gen X grew up sensing instability before they could articulate it. Psychologically, this matters. When a child perceives unpredictability in authority structures, parents, schools, government, the brain adapts. It increases self-monitoring. It lowers blind trust. It prioritizes autonomy over dependence. This is why Gen X developed what psychologists might call self-directed resilience. They didn't just become independent because it was culturally encouraged. They became independent because reliance felt uncertain. The latchkey kid phenomenon wasn't just a social detail, it was a neurological training ground. Coming home to an empty house teaches specific things. You solve your own boredom. You regulate your own fear. You manage your own time. You handle small crises without supervision. This wires executive functioning early, planning, self-soothing, risk assessment, but it also wires something else, emotional containment. If no one is immediately available to process your feelings, you internalize them, not dramatically, not consciously, gradually. Over time, this builds a generation that doesn't naturally externalize distress. They handle it quietly. Another layer. Gen X grew up during the analog to digital shift. Their childhood was offline. Their adulthood became online. That split created cognitive flexibility. They understand delayed gratification because the world required it. Information wasn't instant. Communication wasn't constant. You waited for phone calls, for letters, for answers. Waiting builds tolerance for uncertainty. Later generations grew up with immediate feedback loops. Gen X did not. Their brains were shaped in a slower reward environment. This is one reason they often appear less reactive online. They didn't form identity inside algorithmic mirrors. They formed it through trial, error, and private experimentation. Music scenes, subcultures, skate parks, basement bands, Zion's underground culture. Gen X identity was built through participation, not performance. That difference is subtle but massive. Participation builds internal validation. Performance builds external validation. Gen X tends to lean toward the first. This is also why irony became their dominant cultural language. Irony is emotional distance with intelligence attached. It allows you to engage without overexposing yourself. And for a generation raised amid institutional distrust, emotional distance felt safer than idealism. Boomers believed in systems. Millennials questioned systems emotionally. Gen Z interrogates systems publicly. Gen X learned to operate around systems. They didn't expect them to improve dramatically. They expected them to fluctuate. So instead of demanding transformation, many focused on self-sufficiency. Start your own thing. Keep expectations low. Don't depend too heavily. That sounds cynical, but it isn't purely negative. It's adaptive realism. When you grow up seeing promises collapse from political narratives to corporate loyalty, optimism feels naive. So Gen X developed what could be called guarded pragmatism. Hope, but verify. Trust, but cautiously. Commit, but don't overextend. This shaped their relationships too. Many Gen X individuals value loyalty deeply, but they don't assume it automatically. Loyalty must be demonstrated over time, because time, to them, is proof. Another overlooked factor is economic conditioning. Gen X entered adulthood during recessions and restructuring. Stable career ladders were disappearing. The idea of staying in one company for life was fading. This trained them psychologically to expect volatility. So instead of attaching identity to institutions, many attached identity to competence. Skill over title, ability over brand. Competence is portable. If systems fail, skills remain. That's a survival strategy. But survival strategies come with emotional trade-offs. When you prioritize resilience, you sometimes suppress vulnerability. When you normalize instability, you minimize emotional reaction. Gen X is often described as emotionally steady. What's less discussed is that steadiness was practiced under pressure. They learned not to overreact because overreaction didn't change outcomes. They became observers before participants. This created a generation that can sit in ambiguity without immediate panic. But it also created a generation that sometimes struggles to articulate personal emotional needs. Not because they don't have them, because they were trained to handle them internally. And here's something crucial. Being raised in the middle shaped their identity psychology. They were never the largest voting bloc, never the dominant cultural narrative, never the algorithm's favorite. They grew up between louder generations. When you are chronically in between, you develop translation skills. You understand older structures. You adapt to newer ones. You rarely expect applause. Gen X doesn't chase visibility because invisibility was normal, and invisibility builds self-reference. You learn to ask, what do I think? Instead of what does everyone think of me? That's a profound psychological difference. In a hyper-visible world, that trait becomes rare and misunderstood. Gen X is not disengaged. They are selective. They are not emotionless. They are economical with emotion. They are not pessimistic. They are calibrated. They were raised in the gap between eras, and gaps produce people who learn to stand without a safety net. If you want to understand Gen X emotionally, you have to understand one core principle. They were raised to manage themselves, not express themselves, not showcase themselves, not narrate themselves. Manage that difference. Shape their attachment patterns in subtle but powerful ways. Many Gen X children grew up in homes where emotional conversations were limited, not necessarily abusive, not necessarily cold, but practical. Busy, distracted, parents were working more, divorce was more common, family structures were shifting, emotional literacy wasn't emphasized the way it is today, so Gen X often developed what psychologists might call functional attachment. They bond through reliability, they show love through action, they express care through consistency, not always through words. This is why they can appear emotionally reserved. But reserved does not mean detached. It means controlled. They don't lead with vulnerability. They lead with stability, and stability became their love language. Another layer is hyperindependence. When you grow up solving problems alone, you internalize a rule: needing too much is risky. So even in adult relationships, Gen X individuals often maintain strong personal autonomy. They don't want to merge identities. They don't want constant emotional processing. They don't want dependency framed as romance. They value partnership, but not fusion. This can sometimes look like emotional distance to younger generations who were raised to overcommunicate feelings. But Gen X doesn't believe every emotion needs articulation. They believe emotions need management. That's a big psychological divide. Now let's talk about vulnerability, because this is where things get interesting. Gen X can handle crisis calmly. They can support others through chaos. They can show up when things break. But when it comes to revealing personal fear, doubt, or insecurity, they often hesitate. Why? Because they were trained to internalize uncertainty. If no one consistently validated your childhood emotions, you stop expecting validation as an adult. You don't assume someone else will hold your emotional weight, so you carry it yourself. This produces emotional endurance, but it can also produce isolation. Gen X often becomes the stable one in the group, the rational one, the unshaken one. And when you are cast in that role long enough, you start believing you must stay there. That's pressure. But they rarely complain about it, because complaining feels indulgent. Another key pattern is guarded trust. Gen X does not trust quickly. Not because they are paranoid, but because they were raised during visible institutional failures. They watched systems lie. They watched authority figures fall. They watched narratives collapse. So emotionally, they test consistency over time. Words don't impress them. Patterns do. If you say you care, show up repeatedly. If you promise loyalty, demonstrate it under pressure. They believe in earned trust, and once earned, Gen X loyalty runs deep. They don't cycle friendships easily. They don't discard relationships casually. They don't treat connection as disposable, because they didn't grow up in a swipe culture. They grew up in proximity culture. You dealt with people because they were there. That built tolerance for difference. But here's the paradox. Gen X values loyalty, but they are fully prepared to walk away. If trust is broken, they don't dramatize it. They withdraw. Calmly, silently, permanently. That emotional cutoff isn't explosive. It's efficient. They don't beg for repair if patterns show instability, because their core belief remains: I can survive alone. And that belief is both strength and limitation. Now let's talk about emotional expression in conflict. Gen X often avoids theatrical confrontation. Not because they're afraid, but because they don't see emotional escalation as productive. They prefer directness over drama. Short conversations, clear boundaries, minimal spectacle. But here's what younger generations sometimes misinterpret. Gen X silence is not apathy, it's assessment. They think before responding. They observe before reacting. They conserve energy. They don't externalize every internal shift. This makes them appear emotionally steady, but internally they process deeply. Gen X parents raised the first fully digital generation. Let that sink in. They grew up analog. Their children grew up online. That gap created one of the most psychologically complex parenting shifts in modern history. Gen X entered parenthood with a core belief: figure it out, you'll be fine. Because that's how they were raised. But here's the twist. They didn't want their kids to feel the emotional neglect they sometimes felt, so they overcorrected, but selectively. They gave more emotional openness than they received, but they still valued independence above all. This created a unique parenting style, emotionally looser than boomers, less hovering than millennials, more freedom-focused than Gen Z parents. Gen X parenting can be summarized in one phrase: supportive, but not suffocating. They didn't micromanage every feeling. They didn't track every movement, but they were more emotionally available than their own parents. However, there was a blind spot. They underestimated technology, because when they were kids, danger was physical. Stay out of traffic, avoid strangers, be home by dark. They didn't grow up in algorithmic environments. So when social media arrived, many Gen X parents treated it like television, not like a psychological ecosystem. They assumed digital exposure worked like media exposure. It didn't. Millennials and Gen Z were raised inside comparison machines. constant feedback loops, constant visibility, constant validation metrics. Gen X didn't anticipate how identity would become public performance. So their parenting model, independence, plus light supervision, met a world that required psychological guidance in ways they never experienced. This explains some generational tension. Gen X children often say, "You didn't understand what we were dealing with." Gen X parents often respond, "We trusted you." Both are correct. Gen X valued resilience. But resilience in a physical world doesn't translate cleanly to a digital one. Now let's go deeper. Gen X parents tend to prioritize realism over emotional cushioning. They don't romanticize the world for their children. They warn them about debt, about instability, about job markets, about broken systems, because they lived through economic volatility themselves. This shaped millennials in a specific way. Millennials inherited caution, but also anxiety. They were told, be independent, follow your passion, but also be practical. Don't trust corporations, but build a career. That contradiction produced internal pressure. Gen X tried to prepare their kids for instability, but preparation sometimes became hyper-awareness. And hyper-awareness, in a fast-moving world, becomes stress. Now let's talk about emotional culture in Gen X households. Gen X tends to respect boundaries. They don't naturally overshare with their kids. They don't always process emotions in long discussions. They often model strength more than vulnerability. This had two outcomes. Some millennials learned emotional openness by rejecting emotional restraint. Gen Z went even further, normalizing therapy language, trauma language, and public vulnerability. In many ways, Gen X raised children who emotionally moved in the opposite direction. And that's not failure. That's generational correction. Every generation adjusts what it lacked. Gen X lacked emotional validation and digital guidance. So millennials demanded emotional validation. Gen Z demanded psychological literacy. But here's the part people miss. Gen X parents are often deeply loyal to their children, even when they don't understand them. They may not always grasp internet culture, identity language, or mental health terminology, but they show up in practical ways. Financial help, problem-solving stability during crisis. They may not say I understand fluently, but they say I'll help consistently. Another important factor is pressure tolerance. Gen X parents often expect their children to tolerate discomfort, not cruelty, discomfort, because discomfort built them. But in a world where mental health conversations expanded rapidly, that expectation sometimes feels harsh to younger generations. Gen X sees discomfort as strengthening. Millennials often see it as something to process. Gen Z sometimes sees it as something to prevent. Different psychological frameworks, same root desire, survival. There's also something unique about Gen X parenting and identity freedom. Because Gen X grew up questioning authority quietly, they tend to allow more individual identity expression in their children. Music, fashion, career paths, unconventional choices. They don't cling to tradition as tightly as boomers. They've already seen tradition collapse, so they're less shocked by change. But they still expect accountability. Freedom, yes. Irresponsibility, no. This balance, autonomy plus responsibility, is their psychological signature. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. Gen X is raising children in a world that moves faster than they ever experienced. Their parenting style was designed for slower systems, and that mismatch creates friction. But it also creates strength. Because Gen 10 children inherit something powerful, adaptability. They learn digital literacy from their generation, and grounded realism from their parents. That combination is volatile, but potent. Gen X may not be the loudest generation, but through their children, their psychological imprint spreads widely. They pass down skepticism, they pass down resilience, they pass down guarded optimism, and even when misunderstood, they remain consistent in one thing. They expect their children to stand on their own feet, because that's how they survived. The real question is not whether Gen X parent perfectly, it's whether any generation can fully prepare the next for a world that keeps reinventing itself. And in that sense, Gen X did what they were trained to do: adapt quietly, provide stability, and trust their children to figure the rest out. Gen X is one of the smallest generations in modern history, but they occupy an outsized share of leadership positions: CEOs, senior managers, policy advisors, tech executives, media gatekeepers, school administrators. They don't dominate headlines, but they dominate middle and upper management. Why? Because they matured during institutional instability and learned how systems actually work. Boomers built institutions. Millennials questioned them loudly. Gen X learned how to navigate them quietly. That difference matters. Gen X didn't grow up believing institutions were sacred, but they also didn't grow up believing they could burn them down and rebuild them overnight. They adopted a different strategy: enter the system, understand it, operate inside it, control from within. That's structural power, not cultural power. Cultural power is visibility. Structural power is leverage. Gen X prefers leverage. They don't care about being the face of change. They care about being in the room where decisions are made. Now let's talk about why they seem invisible. Gen X grew up between two loud generations. Boomers, large, dominant. Millennials, large, digitally expressive, culture-shaping. Gen X sits in the middle, smaller in number, less self-promotional, less interested in branding themselves as a generation. They don't constantly narrate their generational identity, so media coverage often skips them. But invisibility has psychological benefits. If no one is watching you obsessively, you can move strategically. Gen X learned to operate without spotlight, and spotlight isn't required for control. Now here's another layer. Gen X came of age during economic shocks, recessions, corporate downsizing, dot-com crashes, housing collapse. They watched companies reward loyalty, then cut employees anyway. That experience shaped how they lead. Gen X leadership style tends to be pragmatic, risk-aware, less idealistic, more contingency-focused. They build backup plans. They assume instability. They rarely trust growth curves without questioning them. Millennials sometimes view them as cautious. Gen X views that caution as realism, because they've seen momentum disappear overnight. This is why many Gen X leaders don't overpromise. They don't announce revolutions. They make incremental moves, quiet adjustments, policy tweaks, strategic hires. They reshape systems slowly, not dramatically. Now let's talk about workplace psychology. Gen X employees were often self-managed early, so when they became managers, they expect autonomy from their teams. They don't want constant meetings. They don't want emotional performance. They want results. But here's where tension arises. Younger generations value feedback loops. They want transparency, recognition, mission alignment. Gen X leadership sometimes undercommunicates vision because they assume competence is enough. That gap can create misunderstanding, not because Gen X lacks empathy, but because they were trained in a different performance culture. Now here's something people underestimate. Gen X is extremely digitally competent, just not digitally loud. They adapted to technology as adults. They understand analog and digital systems. They can operate across both worlds. Boomers struggle with digital shift. Gen Z sometimes struggles with offline systems. Gen X understands both infrastructures. That dual fluency gives them enormous leverage. They can manage legacy systems while implementing digital transitions. They're translators, and translators quietly hold power in transitional eras. Another factor, emotional steadiness in chaos. Because Gen X internalized crisis early, they don't panic publicly during instability. Economic dip, they've seen worse. Tech disruption, they adapted before. Political tension, they grew up during cultural fragmentation. This steadiness makes them stabilizers in leadership roles. But stabilization doesn't trend on social media. So again, invisible. Now let's address something uncomfortable. Gen X sometimes gets accused of apathy, but what looks like apathy is often selective engagement. They learned that outrage cycles burn energy without always changing outcomes, so they conserve. They choose battles strategically. They don't react to everything. That emotional filtering allows them to maintain influence without burning out, but it also makes them less visible in activist culture. And in today's world, visibility is often confused with impact. Gen X rarely confuses the two. Now here's the most important psychological point. Gen X distrusts grand narratives. They don't believe any system is fully stable. So when they hold power, they don't fully identify with it. They see power as temporary and conditional. That makes them less arrogant than some leaders before them, but it also makes them less celebratory. They don't view leadership as identity, they view it as responsibility. That mindset creates controlled authority, not charismatic authority. And controlled authority rarely goes viral, but it shapes outcomes. Now let's zoom out. Boomers built the frameworks. Millennials and Gen Z reshaped culture. Gen X controls, transition points, budgets, approvals, hiring, implementation. They are the hinge generation. Not loud enough to dominate narrative, not old enough to be legacy-bound, not young enough to be cult lead. They are positioned in the operational middle. And in complex systems, the middle layer often determines real outcomes. That's structural power. Here's the final psychological truth. Gen X doesn't need recognition to function. They were never trained to expect applause. They were trained to expect responsibility. And that internal orientation makes them unusually comfortable holding influence without spectacle. They don't need to be seen to feel relevant. They need to be effective. So while headlines focus on generational wars, Gen X continues doing what they've always done. Assess quietly, adapt strategically, lead without theatrics. Invisible, maybe. But invisibility, in the right position, is an advantage.